Here's a look at a recap of your markets on this Friday, the 24th day of October. We are coming to you a bit late tonight, but we got a lot and we'll get right into it and get her done. If there was some positive news this week, it had been found with the grains as both grain futures and cash bids did manage to close higher this week. Another absolutely ugly day in the cattle futures, and we'll get to that some more here shortly. First, we'll take a look at the negotiated feedlot trade this week as of the 2 o'clock cutoff time. 69,464 head of confirmed negotiated sales. Texas turned in 3,094, mostly at 238. That's $2 lower than last week. Kansas, 6,207 head. Live sales from 236 to 240, mostly at 238 there. A few dress sales at 370. Iowa turned in 24,230 head. Live sales range from 232 to 239, mostly at 238, 1 to 2 lower than last week. Dress sales from 365 to 372, mostly around that 370 mark. That's $2 lower than last week. In Nebraska, 22,853 head. The live sales there range from 235 to 239, again, mostly around that 238 mark, $2 lower than last week. Dress sales at 365 to 370, mostly at 370, down $2 from a week ago. Box beef cutout values climbing higher as we're starting to see some seasonal demand build up. Choice closed the week at 375.76. That was up 262 for the day, up 899 compared to last Friday. Select 357.97, up 323 for the day, up 770 for the week. Volume on Friday, 133 loads of cuts, trimmings, and grinds. The Choice Select spread at 1779. Before we get into the futures markets, we'll talk about what happened at the auction barns around the state this week. When all's said and done, going to have about 26,000 head that went through the auction barns. Was a bit of an unusual week this week, and there could be several reasons as to why, but I can't really narrow anything down to one concrete reason. But a couple of things that did stick out this week was of the feeder cattle offering. 52% of the offering through the barn of the feeders was under 600 pounds. I can't remember a week any time that we've had that much of the offering under 600 pounds with hardly any yearlings really going through the barn. Also of note this week, 67% of the feeder offering was steers. On most typical weeks, we run about 62% steers and about 38% heifers or so. When we start to see that heifer number get down in the mid to lower 30s is when we start to really think about, well, maybe a few guys are holding back some heifers. But again, 1 week does not make a trend, but those were some things that sure stuck out this week at the auction barns. Overall, the barn trends for the state going to call the market probably $5 to $10 lower. Now, there was no doubt there was several spots that may have been 20 lower, even 30 lower in places. But at the same time, there was a few drafts of cattle that actually sold higher. But to get any higher money this week, you sure had to bring the goods to town. Taking a look at a few of the stickout sales at the auction barns this week. 28 head of 506-pound steers at South Central Regional Stockyards of Vienna sold at $490. The average statewide on those light 5-weight steers, $451. Had 43 head of 571-pound steers at Unionville sell at $469. 45 head of 633-pound steers in Callaway at $438. Kingsville Livestock Auction sold a load of 757-pound steers at $390. The average this week on those heavy 7-weight steers at $382. Joplin Regional Stockyards had a load of 835-pound steers at $370, and Unionville Livestock Auction a load of 881-pound steers at $367.10. Taking a look at the heifers, there was basically just hardly any heifers whatsoever with any exceptional quality over 700 pounds this week that sold anywhere. There was a couple loads of some heavy 7s, almost 8 weights, that were just really plain common type of cattle that sold, but just no stick out sales on any heavyweight heifers this week. A package of 519-pound heifers at South Central Regional Stockyards, tagged as replacements, sold at $4.38. The average on those light 5-weight heifers this week, and even $4. That package at Vienna was just an absolute outstanding reputation consignment. Black-hided heifers that could have went anywhere, and they were definitely the stick-out kind. 33 head of 588-pound heifers in Kingsville sold at $4.25. Taking a look at those futures markets, we'll start out with the cattle, of course. And as I mentioned earlier, it was another ugly day. Live cattle, October, down 597, 233.75. December and all the rest of the contracts further out were down the limit today. The limit on those live cattle, daily limit, 725. December closed at 233.92, February 233.72. Feeder cattle, the nearby October 354.30, that was down 905. The CME cash feeder cattle index was down $3.54 today. That's based on an 800-pound steer up through the 12-state feeding region. It was at 367.08. That makes the difference between that October nearby and that index $13. Now that has to come together next Thursday at the close. So either the futures on that October have to come up some, or the cash index has to keep dropping pretty swiftly next week. By the way the looks of the futures are, it seems like they believe perhaps the index will come down. Time will tell though. Outside of that nearby October contract, all the rest of feeder cattle contracts down the $9.25 limit again today. That makes 3 of the last 6 trading sessions where the feeder cattle contracts have closed limit down. That's nearly $30 we've lost on the feeder cattle contracts in 6 days. I think back to when I've started this job, and I'm getting a little bit long in tooth, I guess, but when I started this job, the daily contract limits for feeder cattle was 75 cents a day. No, a lot's changed, but there's a whole lot of difference of a few days of 75 cents lower and a few days of $9.25 lower. November feeder cattle 352.20, January 348.17. Lean hogs for December 12 cents higher, 81.90. February down a nickel, 84.30. April down 2 cents at 88.95. Compared to last Friday, live cattle $6.50 to 11.05 lower. Feeder cattle $17.65 to 22.95 lower. And again, you got to add another limit last Friday, so that makes those feeder cattle contracts basically down nearly $30 in the last 6 trading days. Lean hogs, the nearby was 47 cents lower. The further out contracts 30 cents to $1.18 higher. Most of this cattle sell-off today, as has been the case recently, all came about due to more headlines and rumors with no substance whatsoever. Most of today's sell-off occurred because of the set-up meeting next week with Brooke Rollins, the Secretary of Agriculture here in the U.S., and the Secretary of Agriculture for Mexico. And there was plenty of press in Mexico that the whole goal of that meeting from the Mexican viewpoint is to get that border open. Now, whether or not that will happen, time will tell. But all the same, it was enough to, once again, drive down the futures markets. Turning our attention to the grains now, so we can at least end on a somewhat positive note. Cash bids today around the state, corn was 4 cents lower. Soybeans were 5 lower to 2 higher. Wheat was unchanged. For the week, however, corn at the elevators was 4 to 7 higher. Beans 22 to 33 higher, and wheat up 9 cents. On Friday, corn bids in the St. Louis area, 442 to 443, Kansas City at 413. Soybean bids in St. Louis, 1059 to 1061, Kansas City 991 to 1006. Wheat bids in St. Louis, 487 to $5, Kansas City at 487. Taking a look at the futures for the week, soybeans were 19 to 23 cents higher. Wheat was 8 to 9 higher. Corn steady to 2 higher. Soybean meal from $5 to $13.10 higher. Did have some lower closes on Friday, but that was just taking off some of the higher gains that we've seen for the week overall. On Friday, December corn 423 and a quarter, down 4 and 3/4. March at 437, down 4 and a quarter, and May at 445 and 3/4, down 3.5. November beans closed 3 lower at 1041 and 3/4. January down 1 and 3/4, 1060 and a quarter, and March at 1073.5, down 1 and 3/4. Wheat contracts were mixed. December down a half cent, 512 and a half. March down a quarter, 528. May unchanged at 538 and 3/4. The rest of the contracts further out into next summer, all up a half cent. Soybean meal for December up $1.80 a ton, 294.10 was the close. Soybean oil for December 60 cents a hundredweight lower at 50.27. With the Missouri Department of Agriculture, that's your closing markets for this week. This is Tony Hancock.